all these little webkins here are made in China. These two are made in China. North American Indians. And it's made in China. Cool. Polar bear. And it's also made in China. Made in China. My American Girl doll is made in China. Dad, is everything made in China?
We're in the money. We're in the money. We've got a lot.
In Chinese, crisis is the same word as opportunity, right? Well, I had heard that many times, but it turns out not to be true. Beware of anyone who tries to simplify Chinese or China itself. Misconceptions about China abound, but a little-known reality revealed in conversations with citizens is the growing web of connections drawing Kentucky closer to China, a web spreading across commerce, education and the arts, religion, healthcare, adoptions, news and sports, particularly the Olympic Games in Beijing. I'm Buck Ryan, director of the Citizen Kentucky Project of the Scripps Howard First Amendment Center at the University of Kentucky. In the next half hour, you'll have the chance to learn valuable lessons from fellow citizens who share their personal experiences with China. We convened a public forum and conducted interviews with citizens from the Commonwealth and beyond to explore the Kentucky-China connection. They focused on 4 points: dispelling misconceptions, confronting fears, improving schools, and seizing opportunities. When you hear the word China, ask yourself, which one? The rich one or the poor one? Urban or rural? Coastal or inland? China is too big and complex, too old and too new to be confined to just one meaning.
There is a very vast gap between the economic activity and the social activity in the cities on the coast, in the interior and in the rural areas. It's almost like Louisville and eastern Kentucky.
My first trip to Beijing, I was expecting to go there and see people walking around in Mao jackets and riding bicycles. I wasn't expecting to see 24-hour-a-day traffic jams, or even more so, staying in a hotel which was one subway stop away from Tiananmen Square, a short subway stop from Tiananmen Square, and having a Lamborghini dealership, in a luxury mall in the hotels.
China is like Kentucky weather. If you don't like it, wait a minute and see how quickly it can change.
10 years ago, when my son and I went back to China, and in Beijing there were so many millions of bicycles on the road, and he was so shocked. He said, "Oh, the Chinese actually are very good at exercising." I said, no, this is just the main transportation. But today, when you go back to China, for example, millions of cars actually clog roadways and pushing the bicycles on sidewalks.
When I first went there, I remember at the school, the college, the young ladies would wash their hair. There was a long trough, and they turned the cold water on, and they would wash their hair. And I can still remember them flipping their hair back. It was all this, it was a community hair washing session. You wouldn't see that now. The same school today is as modern as any school that I've seen here.
If you go to an American city, you'll see 2 or 3 skyscrapers being built. If you go to Shanghai or Beijing, you see literally hundreds.
When I was a kid, there was a good China, Taiwan, our ally, and red China, our enemy. In the long history of China, could the communist period of our lifetimes be just an anomaly?
They really don't like we're a developing country. And then for 3,800 of the last 4,000 years, they've been the #1 economy. They're back. They're not just coming.
You're talking about capitalism. China in the Song Dynasty 1,000 years ago already had a free property, open property market in urban real estate, and already had developed contracts to a much more sophisticated level than Europe. So I would say it's an historical development that is kind of reemerging after you might say the anomaly of the communist period.
It's another world. I say it's not the China that I knew when I was there 50 years ago.
The First Amendment paints a bright line separating the United States from China. In just 45 words, it offers 5 protections, starting with religion and ending with petition or the right to fight the state. When it comes to religion in China, how free is free?
Before I ventured into China, I had heard a lot of stories about whether and how it's possible to practice religion in China, particularly whether it's possible to be a Christian in China in an open and public kind of way. And the usual story I heard was, well, you can't do it. You can't do it. You have to keep it a secret. You can't tell anybody about it. You have to meet in someone's home, or you can't go to church, et cetera, et cetera. Bibles are forbidden. Well, imagine my surprise when I found myself one day in Nanjing touring a Bible factory.
The organization I'm affiliated is a Christian organization, and I appreciate what the professor says, because there's, I think, an overblown perspective of religious persecution, but I also I think you might have minimized it. Having personal experiences with folks who are in the underground church and who are regularly sought out by state police, also going to a Christian church set up for international individuals that will not allow Chinese to participate if they don't have a foreign passport. It is still under control, and I think that's an important state for people to understand. Is when he says that there's a Christian church in China, that the songs that they sing, the sermons that they preach, are sanctioned by the government.
The Chinese government, 5 years ago anyway, did not want anyone coming in to do any type of sharing whatsoever. Whether it was proselytizing, absolutely, that was not going to take place.
As for freedom of the press, the internet has changed everything. Nonetheless, a Google search there on Tiananmen Square will not yield the same information as a Google search here about the crackdown on pro-democracy demonstrators. A lot has changed over the years.
The Tribune was one of 8 newspapers invited to establish a bureau in China in 1978 when the country opened again. The first correspondent, Tim McNulty, is still at the paper, and I was able to talk to him as well as to Evan Osnos, who's there now. And literally they cover different countries. Tim McNulty flew to Hong Kong, took a train to the border where he walked across a barbed wire fence and was met on the other side by a government handler who escorted him to Beijing. He couldn't go anywhere. He lived in a special compound set aside for foreigners, specifically the press, and we can't say for sure that it was bugged, but the truth is that one day he turned to his wife and said, I need to talk to somebody. We've got a burned out light bulb in our kitchen. And the next morning, before he talked to anybody, people showed up to change the light bulb.
And I think we might buy into a facade that things are free in China, when in fact only the economy is free-flowing, and that the government still has a pretty strong handle on a lot of things that are going on, particularly the press.
There are some Chinese who are blaming the West for restricting that in some ways because of a controversy you may have heard of Yahoo and Google actually providing information on some of their Chinese clients to the Chinese government. You know, the commercial interests of Yahoo depend on working with the Chinese government, and that, in some ways, that Western companies can enable the Chinese government in restricting freedom of the press.
It's a great story about the blogging and how the government controls it as they wish. Two cases, one in which a man complained about how he was treated on his family's vacation. They let it explode in the blogosphere, and ultimately resulted in a local party official in the state where the guy went on vacation being fired, as opposed to another guy who was protesting in another part of China, who was protesting attempts to take over his home to be torn down and built upon, and he became a blog item, and that story's been shut down.
Of course, you know, that we have a lot of restrictions. I mean, in China, there are a lot of restrictions in terms of press and religion. But then you can tell that the people could say whatever they want to say on the street. As long as you do not threaten the state power or state sovereignty, then you are fine.
I use the word totalitarian. I think it's apt in a certain political way, but I think that the Chinese nation at this point is so complex, there's so many centers of activity and even power that I'm not sure just how totally in control any element of Chinese society can be.
A lot of this is going to just naturally fall away as it did in Eastern Europe and other things, that that there's no way you can have a free economy, that you can have kind of free exchange and keep freedom of speech, freedom of press from coming, but it's not there yet, and I think it still may be a while, but I think in this technology, this age of technology, it's going to be virtually impossible for that to continue forever.
A World War II veteran put it bluntly, "I don't trust the Chinese." Well, as it turns out, China doesn't exactly trust America either. So where could we go next, other than down the path of trying to understand why?
I always think of us as the new kid on the block, and I can imagine what I'd feel like if the new kid was trying to order around the rest of us who've been there a long, long time. And I feel very much of that in China.
If the Chinese were truthful with us and willing to say what was on their minds, as in some of the dialogues that we've held, they have been, they say, well, we're afraid of you because you look to us as if you want to rule the world. You are the word they use is a hegemonic power. The last hegemon that they expressed fear of was the totalitarian Soviet Union when it turned against China.
I imagine when we're talking about matters of national security, and that's one of the fears that probably a lot of people have, is do we really want to depend on the Chinese translating what, our president has to say? In fact, our president has kind of taken a proactive approach to that and has passed the National Security Language Initiative, which is a first, and puts hundreds of millions of dollars in language study programs because of the fear that China could be the next national threat.
A lot of this misconception or fear that we just talked about is a result of this lack of understanding. By nature, this group of people is not that aggressive physically. I want to say this. I'm Chinese. I may be biased, but I really want to say this. They build up Great Wall because they want to defend themselves. They want to close themselves. They don't want to go out to grab other people's stuff.
Why does China have all these weapons? Who are they afraid of? Are they going to attack us? And I had to explain, at least in my point of view, that the Chinese are far more concerned about North Korea and the Taiwan Straits issues. And the perennial border disputes with India than they were with the United States as a potential enemy.
Where can we find common ground for understanding each other? Basically, the Chinese are just like us, right? Well, yes and no.
Most of the students that I have, the only contact they've had with Chinese are Chinese graduate students at UK. So their impression is that all Chinese are brilliant. All Chinese major in physics and mathematics. And I said, no, there are some dumb people in China, and there are some dumb people in America. There are ordinary people that work every day and support their family. Very little difference. in the goals and aspirations.
The first time I went to China, what struck me most about the people was that a lot of people were still wearing the Mao suits. And so there was, this green, this sort of army green color and this sort of dark navy blue. And then you'd see the children, and they had red and pink and yellow and bows in their hair and everything. And it made me realize that just like us, the children in your lives are the best thing since sliced bread.
The Chinese are bigger savers than the Japanese, and they're still nowhere near in debt as the Americans. And we see the consumer market over there going for, as far as our eyes can see.
And of course, a small town in China is 2 or 3 million and up.
Once we got out of Beijing, there was just this curiosity. What was this? What was this skin? What did that mean? And it was, of course, my first time there, and I think for many of them, it was the first person with brown skin that they had seen. And I could stop busloads of people.
The hardest thing that I'm dealing with in my job, because I'm responsible for developing all the advertising for Jack Daniels, and if you think about the Jack Daniels brand, a lot of our brand communication is sort of based on heritage and having the oldest registered distillery in the U.S. Well, yeah, it's the oldest registered distillery in the U.S. is 1866, and now you're talking about a culture that goes back millennium.
We can find some common ground in the field of health.
I see 2 points of commonality between China and Kentucky in the realm of health. And one has to do with widespread use of tobacco and the cardiac and respiratory diseases that flow from that. These are both heavily smoking societies. The other issue is occupational safety as a factor in public health. Mining disasters are a huge problem in both China and Kentucky, particularly eastern Kentucky and the Appalachian coal fields.
Chinese have a lot to teach Westerners, Westerners have a lot to teach the Chinese, and I think that, in that kind of interaction, that, both cultures can become a lot stronger and kind of understand each other more. And I think that, lack of understanding, lack of information is a lot of times what leads to fears, whether it's economic or other fears. And so I think that's kind of a big piece of it. And the more opportunities I think you can have for those interactions, the more partnerships you can form.
If you know a people, you're not nearly so apt to wage war on people. Therefore, people to people, those of us who can make exchanges possible, so we know each other, seems to me to be a positive step.
The same word in China can mean different things just by changing the inflection in your voice. Can we ever hurdle the language barrier?
If you speak 3 languages, you're trilingual. If it's 2 languages, you're bilingual. And if you speak 1 language, you're American.
And there is some important facts that we can't deny, that Americans are not studying Chinese language. As of last year, there were more Chinese students learning English than there are Americans living in the United States. As of last year, there were less than 50,000 students learning Chinese.
Part of the problem with in the future commerce in China is they've got a lot of languages. They don't have just one language. They're insisting that the people learn Mandarin, but there are a lot of different languages, and there are a lot of different. It's a very diverse country. I learned in my visit there with the 56 different nationalities.
When President Clinton was organizing a state dinner for a Chinese delegation, White House planners envisioned a huge white tent with intimate tables of 4. They learned the hard way that to the Chinese, both the color white and the number 4 symbolize death, and that a tent was rudely informal. Can understanding culture be more important than language?
I think we overfocus on the language side of things. And this is going to sound terribly culturally imperialistic, but the fact of the matter is the language of commerce is English. And you can wince at that, but I travel to probably a dozen different foreign countries a year, and it's a fact of world commerce. Having cultural sensitivity, I think, is a far, far greater challenge. And knowing the differences in business culture and the differences just in sort of the culture of how people live. And that, I think, can be more of an inhibitor than language is.
You can't separate culture from language, and you can't separate language from culture. They exist together. I do think that learning Chinese and beginning Chinese programs as early as possible, ideally in elementary school level, is something that we really have to work on as Kentucky and as a nation.
It's the thing we need to do in education, not just math and science, which in America needs a lot of help, but we need to understand cultures.
Could studying geography be a lost art?
I was in China last year when the Comair plane crashed, and the headlines were not reading an American plane crash or a Midwest plane crash. They were reading a Lexington plane crash. They not only identified Kentucky, but where the city was. And you can't take an American citizen and even pinpoint where Beijing is or Shanghai, so it's amazing.
And the students should know more about China or other country, more so than just where they are. Students in Hong Kong and Macau, they know everything about the world. Everything. You talk about it, they know it, the education, newspaper, media, everything they know. But in here, you ask high school kids, they have no clue. Oh, where is that part of it? Have no clue.
In some Kentucky schools, we do have hopeful signs.
For the last 2 years, we were paired with a school in Changsha, and this year we're paired with a school in Juzhou. And these are exchanges. There we do. We set up email pen pals. We write back and forth to each other. We send them, things about ourselves, student artwork, or DVDs of our performances, or things like that, and they send those to us. We're currently in the process of putting together a scrapbook about our school and our city and our state that we're going to send to our school, our sister school in Juzhou, and they'll in turn send one back to us.
From my experience, the students, there were 16 students, about half of them had already been to China before they went on this trip from UK to China, either in a high school exchange program or just to tour or with other organizations that have taken them over there. So there's a lot of exchange going on.
China's one-child policy has created opportunities for some Kentucky families.
Over the last 10 years, our agency has brought in about 500 children from China for adoption just in Kentucky, which also means we have about 1,500 people in the state of Kentucky who have spent 2 weeks in China.
For one Kentucky business, it all started with an unsolicited email from China.
Because I'm often asked, what's a 100-person firm doing in China? There's a huge amount of architects. And we've done some real studies, and we found that there's 5 reasons, and I think they would translate to other businesses and to the education side. There's 5 reasons why we're hired. One is the creativity, just something you hear about from the United States and part of it. The second is they're learning our processes. They don't have a long history of companies, and so just trying to get through some of those processes. How do you motivate people? There's a huge amount of turnover in employees. How can you do the little things that we kind of take for granted in business that make a difference? The third thing for architecture is the details and materials. We've got a lot more sophisticated construction methods here. They're coming in China, and so they're learning from that. The fourth is access to the United States. It has been very, very difficult since 9/11 to get into the United States, but it's also a status symbol. If you're working with a U.S. firm and you can get in and travel, some of the top management come here regularly, and that's really a value. The fifth is the brand recognition, the brand value. We have a very hard time even being mentioned in our work here in the U.S. The papers don't mention us, the developers don't mention us, we're not part of the sales pitch. Over there, we're front and center.
The presence of Kentucky in China, I think we need to thank KFC. Yeah, we need to see KFC. KFC has already over 1,500 outlets in China. So I don't know why our kids are so addicted to KFC.
The hope for a citizen century is dawning in U.S.-China relations. For the first time, the future may be shaped more by a multitude of interactions by citizens across borders than by the government controls of the 20th century.
It's my thesis that the greatest untapped resources for meeting the challenges of the 21st century are the energies and capacities of citizens outside government. So the idea of a citizen century, as I've said in my book, it's a phrase, it's a leap of faith on my part. It's not a prediction, it's a hope. And it's also a prescription which says, unless we find ways of turning loose the energies of people outside government in constructive ways, we do not have the capacity to cope with the 21st century's problems. We just will not resolve them.
Last year's news reports focused on the danger of Chinese imports. Today, presidential candidates speak in ominous tones about China's role and leverage in assuming U.S. debt. As China hosts the Olympic Games in Beijing, the last thing it wants is a crisis. The key to averting crisis is to have a constructive relationship, and that takes understanding and dialogue. This program was dedicated to increasing understanding through dialogue. I hope that it has helped to prepare you and your family now and for the future opportunity of what just might be a citizen's century. I'm Buck Ryan. Thank you for watching.
I was in a taxi cab in the middle of Changsha, and the guy's daughter is a student here at UK.
I've partaken in the counterfeit market, and some of the North Face I have in my house was bought at the market in Beijing. To be a business owner in China and then to spend my vacation time in Hebron, Kentucky, which is not even incorporated, looking at the Ohio River has been really just amazing for me.
Just a quick appreciation of the number of times that the Tang Dynasty has come up today.
And it's a piggy bank, and it's really cute. I use it, and yep, it's made in China. This is all the presidents, yeah, and we got it in Washington, D.C., and it says made in China.